Welcome to Patio Ponderings, the podcast from the backyard where we explore the important and obscure in agriculture. From insights into industry trends to reflections on how agricultural roots shape our lives, we're here to spark meaningful conversations as we cover everything from the expected to the obscure. I'm your host, Jim Smith, inviting you to join me as we pull up a chair, take a moment to reflect, and dive into the stories, challenges, and innovations that connect us all to the land. Whether you're a seasoned ag professional, a friend, or simply curious about the roots that shape our lives, this is your space to pause, reflect, and dig a little deeper. So grab your coffee, sit back, and let's get pondering as we enjoy the view, the sounds, and the stories from the backyard. Welcome to the first episode of Patio Ponderings, the podcast. This is the podcast version of my daily blog that I post on LinkedIn. That started several months ago with me just sitting at our outdoor kitchen with a cup of coffee and my computer, gazing over our backyard landscape, listening to the water bubble in our water feature, and just typing and sharing my thoughts about all kinds of stuff. It was just a way for me to get up every morning, spend some time reflecting, maybe a little bit of meditating, and just getting thoughts out. Since then, the Patio Pondering has evolved into a daily discussion of my thoughts and opinions on many different topics. I've had blog posts about reflection, an inward look at myself and my career and what's happening in my life. I've also had many podcasts on leadership, whether it's leadership in nonprofit organizations such as Boy Scouts, or in particular leadership that I see in agricultural businesses, where I've hit on a couple major agricultural topics. And I've also hit on heartfelt topics that typically aren't discussed and open myself up to criticism and judgment. Some of the recent topics that we've covered, most recently covered busyness versus business and how we have activities, but that those activities don't lead to progress. I spent several blog posts talking about performance review frustration. I also had a post talking about the 1992 presidential campaign where I traveled across northern Indiana working for a seed corn company. And I got my first exposure to Rush Limbaugh and political talk radio, and I even talked about how I thought I was going to vote for somebody for president but made a change at the last minute. I had a blog post talking about my grandmother's efforts to save a family farm in the years right before World War II. And the one that probably had the most impact was my discussion on the unfortunate legacy of Pork the Other White Meat campaign that was used by the National Pork Board for several years to promote pork. Because of the opinions I shared and how I was sharing them and some of the topics I covered, I had several friends that suggested that I start a long-form podcast because I was sharing opinions that kind of rocked the status quo in agriculture. So after spending some time doing some researching, I bought a Focusrite 2i2 audio interface, a couple headset microphone, and have set up editing software. So here we are at the beginning of what I hope will be a journey of reflection and learning. So for a quick introduction to me, if you're a friend, you already know these, maybe. I was born in Fort Wayne, here in northeast Indiana. As a young boy, I spent many weekends with my grandparents, both my paternal and maternal grandparents. And growing up, I was a Cub Scout, then a Boy Scout, became an Eagle Scout. I was in 4-H for 10 years. I worked on several farms during high school. My very first job was working on a fox farm where I would come in after school and we'd go through and feed, and I also helped with some harvesting of those foxes. A little fun fact, one of the farms that I worked on at that time was bought by one of my good friend's parents, and now is just a crop farm after the fox farm went belly up. And then I worked on a few pig farms after that and really enjoyed the pig farming, crop farming integration in the late 80s and early 90s. After high school, I went to Purdue. I got a degree in what was called animal agribusiness. That was a blend of animal science classes and ag econ, and it was set up to get me in a position where I could go into a animal farm or animal business. While I was at Purdue, I was a member of Farmhouse Fraternity. I was house manager for a year. I was social manager with Sam Malcolm for a year. The experience I had at Farmhouse got me through college. It helped me get the grades that I did, and I wouldn't have traded that experience for anything. I was also in Block and Bridle, where I served as president for a year. I really enjoyed interacting with other people that had an enthusiasm for livestock. I was on the Boilermaker Tractor Pull Foundation, both the junior board and the senior board. I was on the junior board for Purdue Grand Prix for 3 years. I was on the 1992 livestock judging team. The highlight for me was being number 4 overall in sheep at the American Royal. It's a crazy class. I shouldn't have won, but I did. Well, got 4th place. I was also an animal science ambassador, where we would go around the state of Indiana sharing the updates and good things happening in the Department of Animal Science. I have to remember, when I was at Purdue, the animal science department was just animal scientists. No pre-vets were in the Department of Animal Science. They were just a general degree course within the School of Agriculture. So we had a small department, 200 undergrads, maybe 250. So there was a lot of interaction, and we got to know our fellow students quite a bit. My son's experience in Department of Animal Sciences was different in the 2019 to 2021 time frame, 23, because the Animal Science Department now houses the pre-vet curriculum. So the enrollment in animal sciences ballooned. So my son had a different experience than I did. After I graduated with my bachelor's degree, I went to Kansas State University to pursue a master's degree in swine nutrition. Now, in the fall of my senior year, I had absolutely no clue what I was going to do. I didn't even apply for any jobs. I didn't go to job fair. I just didn't know what I want. And my plan was to buy an International Harvester tractor and a Great Plains drill and move back to Northeast Indiana and start custom planting soybeans in the time before we had Roundup-ready crops. But I had a friend, a fraternity brother that was at K-State, and he said, hey, you need to come out here and talk to this Dr. Jim Nelson. So I sent a letter, ended up having a couple visits, and decided that I would go to Kansas State to get my master's degree. And that was an experience that exposed me to all kinds of facets of the swine industry. And my master's research was twofold. The first part was looking at carcass modifiers to improve carcass leanness and profitability. That used compounds like carnitine and chromium, where we were trying to get pigs leaner. You have to remember that in the mid-90s, we were at the beginning of the pork the other white meat. We were trying to do everything we could from genetics and feeding to make a carcass that was leaner. We were also in that transition of taking pigs from 240 pounds to 260 pounds of market weight. So the work at carcass modifiers was appropriate because we were trying to get a leaner pig. I also looked at the use of zinc oxide and copper sulfate in nursery feeds. That is some long-lasting research. I picked up the work that had started at Illinois, looking at feeding 3, 4, and 5,000 parts per million of zinc from zinc oxide to pigs and how it affected their growth. So my work is the work that solidified using 3,000 parts per million of zinc in nursery feed diets. And we were looking at that in comparison with the copper sulfate, and we found that feeding that high level of zinc for the first 2 to 4 weeks of that pig's post-weaning life improved stool scores, improved growth, and improved survivability. And we're still trying to find a replacement for that recommendation. I decided to stay at Kansas State with my PhD after talking with Iowa State and University of Kentucky. I thought it made more sense to just seamlessly transfer into a PhD program at K-State. And in that work, I again had 2 parts of my dissertation. One part was describing the lysine to calorie ratio for growing and finishing pigs. We fed pigs different levels of fat and different levels of lysine to determine where that lysine to calorie ratio is. But the biggest part of my dissertation was spent looking at the use of ultrasound to determine on-farm growth curves and farm-specific nutrient requirement curves. And that involved ultrasound in pigs on 2 farms in Kansas and a farm in southwest Minnesota. That was fun because I was able to look at whether we took a group of pigs and we ultrasound and weighed those pigs every 3 weeks, or did we go into a system and scan and weigh those similar aged pigs all at one time. So you'd go through and you'd weigh pigs that were there the first day, and then that had been in the barn for 3 weeks and 6 weeks and 9 weeks and so on, to see if we could just go in and do that at one time period and get a growth curve. The neat part about my PhD committee is I was able to get Dr. Schinkel from Purdue to be on my committee at Kansas State. So it was nice to have his input and have him serve on my committee, so it kept my Purdue roots. While I was at Kansas State, I was awarded Outstanding Master's Student, and then the research I did with the ultrasound was worthy of a National Pork Producers Council Award of Innovation in 1998, I think I received that. So I finished my degree and we moved to Iowa. I started my career after grad school working for ADM Animal Health and Nutrition, formerly the Feed Specialties Group, and I was a field nutritionist. And that gave me my very first exposure to sales and sales support. Nothing in grad school prepared me for that experience. It didn't prepare me for the transition from a pure research academic career to making feeds, riding with salesmen. Grad school didn't prepare you for that. In that role, I covered Iowa, parts of Illinois, Minnesota, South Dakota, Nebraska, Missouri. So I rode with salesmen and made products for them. I spent some time at Kemin. The thing I took from my Kemin experience was the training that we had for sales from a technical selling standpoint, where we did sales training and scenarios where you looked at selling from a technical standpoint. Then here's your team, here's your tech expert, here's your salesperson, here's your customers, and how that team would work together to find solutions to help the customer with their needs. And that set you up to find the strengths of everybody on your team and how you could seamlessly go back and forth between sales role, tech roles, and service roles. And I use skills I learned at Kemin still today. I worked at International Nutrition for a few years. They were based out of Omaha. And in that role, I was tech support for products that we sold to Vietnam and Southeast Asia. And I was fortunate enough to spend about a month in Vietnam, going around the country, looking or selling products, visiting customers, putting on seminars. It was my only experience dealing with a translator, so those presentations were fun to give, but frustrating at the same time. And I got to see parts of Vietnam that I never thought I would get. And as an American, 40 years after the fall of Saigon at the end of the Vietnam War, it was interesting to walk where many GIs and one of my cousins had actually walked. After that experience, and Kim, my wife, graduated from vet school at Iowa State, we had the opportunity to move back to Indiana. We were fortunate that she got a job in a vet clinic that was close to where I was born. And because of that, I was able to start a job with Hubbard Feeds, where I was a swine nutritionist for the East Central Business Unit, which covered Illinois to Pennsylvania. And in that role, I helped customers and dealers use Hubbard products. I walked barns, I made sales calls, made service calls, and then I actually, towards the end of my tenure there, had some direct sales experience where I was responsible for about $1 million worth of gross margin business, and most of that was Indiana, Ohio, and southern Michigan. And then when Hubbard tore down the mill in Indianapolis and eliminated the swine sales in Indiana, I switched over to being a technical swine nutritionist at Kent Feeds. I was supposed to be the swine nutritionist for the Eastern Corn Belt, and there was going to be a counterpart in the Western Corn Belt, and we would have collaborated to cover Kent dealers in the traditional Kent territory, which was South Dakota, Nebraska, parts of Kansas, east to Ohio. In reality, I was the only outside nutritionist we had, so I covered everything from Nebraska to Ohio, and also covered some sales and promotion in the Blue Seal territory, which was the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic states, and made some sales calls in Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, in service customers in Vermont and Maine at the same time. And as the swine market changed, and we had some restructuring at Kent, the tech team came under the marketing umbrella. And in the past few years, I spent more time helping design marketing programs, and I served as the face for Kent swine programs in media and online. And in my role, in addition to supporting customers, dealers, and supporting the marketing group, I also served as more of a consultant for some very large customers. And as that consultant role, I was obviously paid for selling Kent products, but if it made sense for us to use a non-Kent product to improve profitability for these operations, I had the freedom to make those recommendations. And that was really fulfilling, working with large producers. I mean, I was working with producers that were feeding between 100,000 and 2 million pigs a year, and looking at how my recommendations were affecting their bottom line was a fun experience. And then more recently, I was working in product development. There was a couple products I made that reduced time to market, increased carcass weight, made for more money for customers, had more pigs that were marketable. Also had a new nursery feeding program that was designed to combat the challenges that we have with E. coli scours. And then the last year, I was the manager of the swine farm at the Kent Research Farm. I wasn't dictating or managing the research, but I was integrating with the veterinarian. I was leading monthly meetings to make sure that we were getting pigs fed right. I was working with the schedule. At the end, I was looking for a new supply of pigs, and then I was also working with the swine crew to determine when we needed to market pigs. So that's my time at Kent, and a short resume of what I've done since graduating from high school. On a personal level, I've been a 4-H resource leader for many years. I was a Cub Scout den leader for 2 years. I was assistant den leader before that. And then I've also served as a Boy Scout leader, not in direct troop leadership, but as more of a resource. In fact, this week I was on a board review for a young man that was working on his tenderfoot. So it's interesting sitting there and on that side of the table and thinking back to the time I was being grilled on my master's and my PhD defenses. From a farming history, my first experience in livestock was having 2 pigs at some friend's house in 1987. 2 pigs that were bought from a hog farmer outside Monroeville, Indiana. And if you would look at pictures of those pigs now and compare them to the show pigs that my son shows, you would almost think they're different species. But that was the one that kind of got my bug planted for wanting to be in the hog industry. Then in 1988, I convinced my mother I needed to plant soybeans on one of her farms that was not being planted by a sharecropper. And if you're from the Midwest, if you've got any age to you, you know what 1988 was. It was a drought, and you can imagine what kind of crop I had. Didn't have a crop. So my first foray into crop farming was a failure. When we moved to Iowa, we were trying to find places to live that made sense, and we had 2 horses, and it made sense for us to buy a farm instead of boarding a couple horses. So we bought a square 40 in Boone County and had a cash renter that farmed the crop ground for a couple years, and then we transitioned to making that all hay, and we small squared and had some round bales made on those 35 acres of hay. It was nice that Kim was in vet school because we could get some cheap labor from her friends, a little bit of cash and some good food, and we got some good labor. And when we moved back to Indiana in 2009, or actually we moved in 2007, we sat down and discussed whether we were going to sell the hay equipment we had or bring it with us to Indiana, and we decided to bring it with us to Indiana. So we brought a tractor, hay baler, hay mower, nice set of wagons, a hay elevator to our newly bought farm in Allen County, Indiana. And after a year and a half, we convinced some neighbors to rent us some of their ground, and we planted our first crop, which was all soybeans, and we planted 17 acres of alfalfa. And from there, we've expanded. We plant corn, soybeans. We still have 20 acres of hay that we use for feeding our flock of 40 ewes. And we're real farmers. We got skin in the game. In fact, after this podcast recording, I have to meet with my crop insurance adjuster and see where we are on the 2024 crop. The thing about having skin in the game on the crop production side that helps me as a swine nutritionist is that I understand the quality of our corn and the soybeans that go into making soybean meal. There's a handful of us nutritionists. In fact, there's only 2 other that I can think about that have skin in the game this way. And when I have conversations with them about how their crop is doing, it really helps me as a swine nutritionist understand how we're feeding our product. The other thing it does, it helps me put pressure on the crop industry to think about the final customer. And I think about soybeans and soybean meal all the time. That's a soybean meal that I fed to my pigs in 1988 is nowhere close to the soybean meal I'm feeding to customers' pigs in 2024. And that experience helps me put pressure back to the soybean industry to say, hey, we need to do something different. So you could summarize me is that I can go from sitting in front of the computer making a feeding program and jumping into the tractor cab that evening and be planting soybeans or driving grain car. There was a time when I was in Iowa, I went from driving a semi one day to wearing a suit and tie, standing in front of a team of executives in Minneapolis at Cargill selling products. So I can move from a brainstorming session talking about marketing products to a level of executives to trying to manage a room full of teenagers, teaching them about knots and other scout skills. So I've got an interesting blend of talents that my experiences have given. The other thing why agriculture is important to us, my daughter works for Neogen, where she is a marketing manager for beef genetics. Talking to her about the decisions that her customers are making and the tools they're using to make genetic advances in their dairy and beef herds is just amazing. The things that we can do and the things that she's helping producers do were unfathomable when I was in undergrad. And then my oldest son works for an Australian company that markets lamb to the United States. So they import both human consumption lamb and lamb that is used in the pet food industry. And my son's concentrating on logistics and supporting the pet food industry. Why am I taking that experience and turning it into a podcast? Well, I just think I've got something to share, and after we talked about before my friend's suggestions, here we are. So what is this podcast going to be? Well, we're going to cover important ag topics. We might talk about confirmation of the new USDA secretary. But more importantly, I want to spend time talking about how our ag roots affect us. And as we talk to guests, we're going to get the expected. Well, I learned responsibility by doing chores. I learned that you got out of bed, you were ahead of somebody else. Those are the expected things I want our guests to talk about. But what I'm going to look for is those obscure nuggets that we learn from being in agriculture and how they affect us today. Because we all have them. I can think about a couple for my kids that I'll let them share if they choose to. But we're going to dive in and try and find those obscure nuggets on how agriculture affected us and how that might set us apart from other people that we work with in our various industries. And we're going to talk to people that are no longer in ag, but they had a solid ag background and how they set them up for their successes today. What this podcast is not going to be is an ag news podcast. There's others that do it and do it well. You can listen to Ag News Daily on their weekly podcasts that cover ag news topics really well. I mean, you could listen to Agri Talk, whether it's the AM or the PM with Chip Flory and Davis Michelson every day. Joe Vaclafic with his free content every morning is great, and his paid subscription is even better in what he covers. There are many other places to get good ag content. I'm not going to be one of those because I think I want to look more at the personal side. And then when it's appropriate, we're going to dive into stuff and maybe question some things that are going on that need to be questioned. So I want to keep all our episodes conversational, just like we're sitting around the outdoor kitchen on our patio, enjoying the view, enjoying the sounds of our waterfall. I want to have a relaxed dive and find the unexpected and obscure, regardless of the topic or the guest. But at the same time, I want to be informative. We're going to have a fun time. We're going to have a blend of solo discussions and guests. The first few are going to be just me talking about stuff. Then we'll start jumping into having some guests. Along the way, I hope you learn a little bit more about me, and I hope you learn a little bit more about agriculture. And more importantly, I hope you get a better insight into how agriculture roots have affected all of us in agriculture and out of it, and in particular, how our guests have used their agricultural roots to be successes in their own lives. So thank you for joining me on the journey. I'm looking forward to the lessons, both the expected and the obscure, that we cover as we spend our time together each week. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Patio Pondering. We hope you enjoyed exploring both the expected and obscure corners of agriculture with us. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast on your favorite platform. We'd love to hear your thoughts and suggestions. Connect with us anytime at jim@patiopondering.com. Until next time, keep growing, exploring, and cultivating.